Hello, thanks for joining me. My name is Robert Lawson. I'm a professor in the Cox School of Business at Southern Methodist University, and I direct the Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom. Today I want to talk to you about a concept called trade. It's a small word for a very big idea. It's an idea that economists have been talking about it for a very long time anyway. The essence of trade is if you have something that someone else wants and they have something that you want. Here we've got a comic where the one caveman wishes he had a rock, and the other one wishes he had a stick. The good news is the guy who wants a stick sees a guy with a rock and so forth, right? So you can see that these guys have an opportunity to make a trade. In fact, I made a trade this morning on my way to work. I stopped off at McDonald's and I made a trade for this cup of coffee. It's gone now, but it was a lovely cup of coffee this morning at 7 a.m. I gave them $1. This is a $1 cup of coffee. And I was very happy to do that. So economists have been talking about trade for a long time, but people have been doing trades for a long time. I dare say a day doesn't go by where each and every one of us in this room doesn't make a trade. Adam Smith talked about trade in The Wealth of Nations in 1776. He recognized that stick and rock example, or the McDonald's and the dollar example. He says, the essence of trade is to give me that which I want, and you shall have that which you want. It's the idea that economists call a double coincidence of wants, which is a very wonky way of saying it's just a coincidence that I happen to have $1 in my pocket and McDonald's happens to have a cup of coffee. If I have $1 and they have a cup of coffee and I want the coffee and they want the dollar, we have this double coincidence of wants, and it's an opportunity for trades. We trade so often that I don't think we really appreciate how important it is to us as human beings. In fact, I think it's arguably the case that it makes us human. The essence of being a human might be that we trade with other human beings. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations again said, a man is an animal that makes bargains. No other animal does this. No dog exchanges bones with another dog. Now that's true, actually. If you think about it, I've seen dogs steal bones from other dogs. I've seen a dog run up to another dog and grab his bone and run away with it. I've seen human beings steal from other human beings. Stealing doesn't make you uniquely human. Lots of animals steal from other animals. But trading, you ever seen a dog go up and buy a bone from another dog? That's not something I think I've ever seen. Now, I'm no biologist, but I think there are examples in the animal kingdom of things that look something like trade to us. But I do know one thing with fair degree of certainty. No other animal on earth is ever going to come up with a 30-year mortgage. I mean, we have elevated the art of trading to the highest of art forms. And it's something I think makes us different from the other animals. It's not because we have 2 eyes, a nose, and and 2 ears, right? Other animals have those things. What makes us human, I think, is that we trade. And it's, again, a uniquely human thing. So I was really happy to get this cup of coffee this morning. It pleased me. In business schools, like the one I teach in, the Cox School of Business, we have sayings that we say all the time, like trade creates value or value creation. If you're a business student, you hear these terms all the time. It kind of gets a little bit cliched. You get tired of hearing value creation. It's a buzzword. Does it really mean anything? Well, the answer is it does mean something. I'm going to show you a movie clip from one of my favorite movies, Pretty Woman, and there's a really great trade that goes on in the movie.
Don't you knock?
Vivian, I have a business proposition for you.
What do you want?
I'm going to be in town until Sunday. I'd like you to spend the week with me.
Really?
Yes. Yes, I'd like to hire you as an employee. Would you consider spending the week with me? I will pay you to be at my beck and call.
Look, I'd love to be your beck and call girl, but you're a rich, good-looking guy. You could get 1,000,000 girls free.
I want a professional. I don't need any romantic hassles this week.
If you're talking 24 hours a day, it's gonna cost you.
Oh, yes, of course. All right, here we go. Give me a ballpark figure. How much?
6 full nights, days to 4,000.
6 nights at 300 is 1,800.
You want days too?
2,000.
3,000.
Done.
Holy shit!
Vivian. Vivian, is that a yes?
Yes. Yes.
I'll be gone most of the day. I want you to buy some clothes.
You really should think about traveler's checks.
We may be going out evenings. You'll need something to wear.
Like what?
Well, nothing too flashy, not too sexy. Conservative, you understand?
Boring.
Elegant. Any questions?
Can I call you Eddie?
Not if you expect me to answer.
I would have stayed for 2,000.
I would have paid $4. I'll see you tonight.
Baby, I'm gonna treat you so nice.
Well, I like that video clip because it's one of my favorite video clips for teaching and talking about economics. Let's be honest, I kind of like Julia Roberts too. So the first part of that scene, the famous bathroom scene where they make this deal. What was the deal? Let's see. He initially offered to purchase her services. We could be a little vague about what these services might have been, but he offered $2,000. She counteroffered at $4,000, and they agreed on a price of $3,000. Now let's reflect on that for just a second. Okay, that's pretty normal, right? You've probably done this yourselves. You've bargained with anybody before? Something like that's happened? You've seen other movies and TV shows like that? The trade itself isn't terribly exciting. We see trades happen so often in our lives, we do them ourselves, that the trade isn't too interesting. What's really interesting is the last part of the movie clip as he's leaving the hotel room. What did she say? I would have stayed for $2. Let's reflect on that for just a second. How much is she going to get? $3,000. They agreed to a price of $3,000. How much would she have stayed for? $2,000. So she's selling something that she would have sold for $2, but she actually got $3. It's almost like she found a $1,000 bill laying free on the sidewalk. If you've had an economics class, you probably have studied supply and demand. And when we teach about this concept, we call it producer and consumer surplus. These are jargon words we use in classrooms when we teach economics. But you drew a supply and demand graph and you shaded in a triangle and you said, well, that's producer surplus. No. Producer surplus is Julia Roberts when she sells something for $3,000 that she would have sold for $2,000. And of course, she was really happy about that, right? You could see that famous smile. Now let's talk about Edward, the other guy. He said he would have paid $4. I would have paid $4, he says. So he's the buyer. If you're a buyer and you would have paid $4,000 for something and you go to the store and you see that the price is only $3,000. Again, that's like you found $1,000 for free on the sidewalk. Economists call this consumer surplus. And again, there's a triangle on a supply and demand graph in textbooks. But what it really is what we saw in that movie clip. Now, when I say trade creates value, that word creates was intentional. Value literally gets created by trade. Where was the value? Where was those $1,000? Where were those free $1,000 bills on the sidewalk? Where were they before the trade? Well, they didn't exist. How did Julia Roberts create that $1,000 of value? Well, by making the trade. How did he create $1,000? Well, by making the trade. The act of making the trade is what created the value. Now, as you might know, that was an illegal trade. What would have happened had the Los Angeles Police Department Vice Squad run into the bathroom with guns out and say, all right, you're all under arrest. This deal is off. What would have happened to the value? It would have poofed into thin air. It would have gone away. It wouldn't have existed. Right? We don't have a conservation principle in economics when it comes to value. In physics, there's a conservation principle of matter and energy. You can never create or destroy matter and energy. If you've had a physics class, you might remember that. We don't have that principle in economics. Value gets created from, where was it before? Well, it wasn't anywhere. It got created by the act of the trade. And we can measure that value if we know those numbers. If you know what the buyer was willing to pay, he was willing to pay $4, and what they actually had to pay, we can actually measure the value that got created by that gap between what they were willing to pay and what they have to pay. Or for the seller, what the seller was willing to accept and what they actually did get. So value gets created and value can be destroyed. When trades happen, value gets created, happiness gets created. When trades don't happen, value doesn't get created. Now, there's one last little lesson about this that I think is worth reflecting on as well. This is Adam Smith's famous invisible hand quote from The Wealth of Nations. It's probably the most famous quote in The Wealth of Nations. When I went to McDonald's this morning for this cup of coffee, was I thinking about the welfare and the well-being of the person working in the McDonald's? Well, no, let's be honest with ourselves. It was 7 a.m., and I was tired, and I wanted some caffeine to help me wake up. I was thinking of myself and my own well-being. Now, do you think the clerk who made that cup of coffee and put it in the cup and handed it to me in the window, do you think that clerk, when they woke up in the morning, I mean, they probably had to wake up at, how early do you have to wake up? 4 o'clock in the morning. When they woke up in the morning, were they thinking, I can't wait to serve Bob Lawson a hot, piping cup of coffee and make his life better? No, that person was thinking about themselves. That person was like, well, I got to go to work so I can earn money, so I can pay rent, buy clothes, go on vacation, or whatever, right? I was thinking of myself, and primarily myself, and the clerk at McDonald's was thinking of herself, and pretty much primarily herself. I was interested in me, she was interested in her, and yet I helped her. I helped her because I gave her $1, and some portion of that dollar is going to work its way into her bank account and help her pay her rent and buy clothes and go on vacation. She helped me because she gave me a cup of coffee, and I like cups of coffee in the morning, right? When I left at McDonald's, I said, thank you, and she said, thank you. I don't remember now if she said, come again, but if she had, I would like, I probably will. Like tomorrow morning, I might do it again. Trade makes people happy. It creates value. It's good. The interesting thing that Adam Smith recognized in this invisible hand quote is it's not required that we care about the other person that much. Even if you only care about yourself, trade still creates value for the other party. And that's a good lesson. Some people think this lesson is a greed is good lesson, and it's not that. Greed's not good. If you're greedy, what does that mean? It means you're going to do things to harm other people to help yourself. That's what greed is. Thieves are greedy. When a thief steals your car, the thief is greedy. He wants your car. But that doesn't help you. That hurts you, right? Thieves hurt people. They exercise their greed by hurting people. But trade is a way for me to exercise my self-interest and actually help other people. I helped her pay her rent a little bit, tiny bit, right? And she helped me wake up. Trade creates value, but it's a two-way street. And the good news is it doesn't really require that we love each other that much. It still works. Now, I hope we love each other. It would be a good thing if we loved each other more. But the good news is, even if we don't love each other, trade still creates value for both parties. So it's pretty easy to talk about how trade makes us happy. I can talk about buying cups of coffee at McDonald's. I can talk about Julia Roberts' famous scene in Pretty Woman. Why does trade makes us rich is harder. When I bought that cup of coffee, it's not at all obvious that I made the world richer. I mean, I had $1 in my wallet. McDonald's had a cup of coffee in their store. After we made the trade, I now had a cup of coffee. They have my $1, but there's no more stuff. There's no more dollars. There's no more cups of coffee in the world after the trade than before the trade, all right? So how does it make us rich? Well, the answer is that because we can trade, we can specialize. So one of the most important ideas in economics is specialization. It is really why we're rich. The guy that came up with this idea of specialization in trade and what he called his law of comparative advantage is a guy named David Ricardo. Comparative advantage is a jargony word that economists use, and really what it means is what you're good at. Ricardo recognizes that we're different. Some people are good at some things, some people are good at other things, and what really should happen for us to do well in our world is to have those people who are good at A do A, and those people who are good at B do B. In this comic strip here, the young girl, the brunette, she's written a lovely romantic email to her potential boyfriend, and he's complimenting her on the romantic email. But you notice, if you look at the second panel, she didn't write it. The little sort of nerdy girl with the glasses, she wrote the email. Why didn't the brunette write her own email? Well, the answer is she's not good at writing romantic emails, and the little nerdy girl is very good at writing romantic notes. So she contracted out. She had someone else do it. In the language of economics, the little nerdy girl is specializing in writing romantic emails. Because she's good at it. All right? Well, that's the lesson in sort of general terms. So the only way I know how to talk about comparative advantage and really illustrate why it makes us rich is to use some numbers. So here I've got some made up numbers for two countries, the United States and Japan, and two goods, food and clothing. It could be two people. It doesn't have to be groups of people like countries, but it's easier to think about this in the international trade context for two countries. So the 2 and the 1 there are productivities. The 2 is how much food an American worker can make in a day. The 1 is how much clothing an American worker can make in a day. The 3 and the 9 for Japan are how much food and clothing Japanese workers can make in a day. So a Japanese worker can make 3 units of food a day and 9 units of clothing a day. It looks like the Japanese workers are more productive than the American workers, but just bear in mind, these numbers are completely made up. They're only made up just to make a principle. But it looks like Japanese workers are better at making food and making clothing than the American workers are at making those items. But let's do a little thought experiment. Suppose the US moves 3 of its workers from clothing to food. Now, if we move workers out of clothing, they're not going to make clothes anymore. So if we move 3 workers out of clothing, we lose 1 unit of clothing per worker, so we lose a total of 3 units of clothing. If we move 3 workers in the United States into food, though, they're now going to make food. And if they each make 2 units of food, that's 6 units of food for the Americans. In Japan, we're going to do the same thing, but we're only going to move 1 worker just to make the math work nice and easy. If we move 1 worker in Japan from food to clothing, it'll produce 9 more units of clothing, but we'll lose the 3 units of food because they're not making food, they're now making clothing. So what's happening here is specialization. The US is specializing in making food. It's moving resources, people, away from making clothing and into making food. And Japan is specialized in making clothing. They're moving resources out of food and into clothing. But by doing that specialization, what happens to the total amount of food and clothing in the United States and in Japan, like in the world? Well, it's higher. We have a total of 3 more units of food and a total of 6 more units of clothing. The world just got richer. It didn't get richer because people worked harder or we had a technological innovation or anything like that. It simply worked because we specialized. So the act of specialization makes more stuff. It makes more food, more clothing, more houses, more of everything. When people specialize in what they're good at, or again, to use the language of economics, when they specialize in what they have comparative advantages in, we get more stuff. Now, that was fun, right? So let's do it again. What if you imagine we just kept moving workers in the United States from clothing to food, and we kept moving workers in Japan from food to clothing, just kept doing this, and every time we move workers in each direction in the United States and Japan, we just get more food and more clothing, +3, +6, just keep doing this, keep doing this. Eventually, we're very rich. We got a lot of food, we got a lot of clothing. Of course, there is a little bit of a problem, right? Because in Japan, they've got all this clothes. They got a lot of well-dressed Japanese people, but they don't have anything to eat. They're like skinny, starving, well-dressed people. But in the United States, what do we have? We have all the food, but we didn't make any clothes. So we're all naked, fat people. This is terrible, right? We don't want to live like that. So what's got to happen? Well, trade, right? What has to happen is the United States or Japan, we got to call each other and say, hey, you know, we're really good at making food in the United States, and you're really good at making clothing in Japan. How about we trade? How about we send some of our food to you, and you send some of your clothing to us? And the result is we're gonna all live much better. All of us are gonna have more food and clothing than we otherwise would. Our standard of living, the reason we have food and clothing and TV sets and refrigerators and all kinds of things, hinges on specialization. But notice that trade is required. If you couldn't trade, if the United States couldn't trade with Japan, it wouldn't make sense to specialize because we'd have to make some of our own clothing. We can't go without clothes. If Japan couldn't trade with the United States, they wouldn't specialize in making clothing because they got to eat. So this specialization thing only works with trade. Economists say the phrase specialization in trade almost as if it was one word, one really long word, specialization in trade. It's one word because you really can't have specialization unless you have the expectation that you're going to be able to trade away this thing that you've specialized in. So I've argued here that our standard of living, the reason we live as well as we live, hinges on our ability to specialize and then trade. And you kind of actually knew this already because you may have seen a movie, Castaway, with Tom Hanks. Somewhat famous movie. I don't think it's quite as famous as Pretty Woman. But if you remember the movie, Tom Hanks worked for Federal Express, FedEx. He was an executive. He hopped on an airplane, was flying home to Memphis, was a FedEx plane, and it didn't make it. It crashed in the Pacific. He ends up on a deserted island all by himself. The pilots are dead. He's the only one in survival. A few crates of FedEx things have walked up. He had that, remember the volleyball, Wilson, all right? So you remember, there were things that he had on the island, but he was all by himself. One of the most gruesome scenes in the movie was this scene where he had a toothache. Before the movie, he called his wife and said, man, when I get home to Memphis, I gotta go to the dentist because I got this toothache. Well, he never made it home to Memphis. He ends up on this deserted island. So what happens now? He's got to be his own dentist. And one, again, particularly gruesome scene, he takes a rock and an ice skate that washed up on the island with him, and he knocks, it's terrible, terrible. I don't show the movie clip because it's absolutely sickening. But he had to be his own dentist. Now, in our world, what happens if you get a toothache? I just go to the dentist. There's a person somewhere out there, actually thousands of people that have specialized in being dentists. And when I have a toothache, I just go to one of them and they fix it. On a deserted island, all by yourself, Tom Hanks had to be everything. He had to make his own food. He had to make his own fire. It's like this 20-minute scene. It took forever in the movie where he's trying to make fire. And it was really hard to make fire. I've done it once, like as a Boy Scout. It's really hard to make fire. So he finally makes fire. He's so happy for himself. And then it rained. He had to do it again. Anyway, so he made fire. He had to be his own. He had to make his own house. I didn't make my own house. I bought my house, right? I don't make my own food. I buy food, right? He has to be his own food farmer. He has got to make his own houses. He's got to, be his own dentist. Now, in real life, what would have happened to a middle-aged FedEx executive who lands all by himself on a deserted island? In real life, he probably dies. In fact, that toothache probably kills him. By the time a toothache is so bad that you're willing to extract it with a rock and an ice skate, that infection's probably in your spleen by now. So you're probably already dead. People used to die of toothaches. So Tom Hanks would have died in real life. Now, of course, in the movie, in Hollywood, what happens? He learns how to make fire. He learns how to catch fish. He learns how to make a shelter. He learns apparently how to be a dentist. And by the end of the movie, I think he was on the island for 4 years in movie time. He was supposed to have been there 4 years. By the end, he's like 190 pounds of pure muscle. He's a Superman. That's not probably what happens in real life. In real life, he dies. No one's going to pay money to Hollywood to see a guy die, so Hollywood doesn't make that movie. But I like that movie. It's bad economics, though, because in real life, the absence of specialization in trade probably means poverty and death for most of us. So that's our second lesson. It's really, in some ways, more important than the first lesson. The first lesson's fun. First lesson was trade makes us happy, creates value. We can demonstrate that with the McDonald's example or the movie clip from Pretty Woman. But the second example is actually probably more important because it explains our standard of living. It explains why we live as well as we live. We live as well as we live because we live in a world where each and every one of us specializes in whatever you're good at. And some of you, I think, are probably still trying to figure that out. That's fine. But you specialize in what you're good at, and then you trade with other people who themselves are specialized in what they're good at. And the result is a standard of living that really isn't that bad, certainly compared to the way our ancestors lived. So trade is a controversial topic. I make it sound like, wow, who would be against this thing called trade? It creates value, it makes us rich. Who would be against trade? Well, even in Adam Smith's day, there were people who didn't like trade. In his day, there were people that especially didn't like trading with the French. The British had been fighting wars on and off again for centuries with the French. This crazy Scotsman, Adam Smith, with his funny accent, he says, hey, we should trade with the French. And they're like, what do you mean? No, they're our enemies. And Adam Smith had a very simple argument for it. He talks about it in The Wealth of Nations. He says, why should we trade with the French? It's because their wine is cheap. He mentions that, by means of glasses, hotbeds, and hot walls. I'm not sure what glasses, hotbeds, and hot walls are. I think it's greenhouses or something like that. But by means of certain technologies, you can grow very good grapes in Scotland and make fine wine. But it's going to be 30 times more expensive than French wine. Adam Smith says, you know what's better? You know what's better? Wine that's $30 or wine that's $1? $1 wine sounds better than $30 wine. Adam Smith recognized that the French were better at making wine. The climate was better there for growing grapes. You can do it in Scotland, but it's just going to be really, really costly. And so he said we should trade with the French. And of course, what are we going to sell to them? Well, we can sell wool, because in England, it's cold. In Scotland, it's cold. We have sheep, and they get really big fur coats, or wool coats, I guess. Not fur, it's wool, right? And they grow, and we can trade the wool that we're really good at making here in the British Isles, and we'll trade that to the French, okay? So Adam Smith recognized that there are people out there in his era that didn't like trade, and he had to engage them, and we're still doing that today. There are some arguments against trading. Most of these arguments are going to be couched in international trade terms, like why we should or shouldn't trade with China, why we should or shouldn't trade with Mexico, or why we should or shouldn't trade with Cuba or whoever. There are some arguments. The three arguments that you hear the most are national defense, dumping, and the infant industry argument. Let's take each one of these in turn. Now, the national defense argument is the one that I think has the most plausibility. It's the one that I don't disregard entirely. The national defense argument is that, you know, maybe it's not a good idea to trade with North Korea. Like if North Korea calls up a supercomputer company or even Apple and says, hey, would you sell us an Apple computer? And the American government says, you know, we really shouldn't do that. Why? Well, because they're an enemy, right? They have missiles pointed at our allies, South Korea, Japan, and we're worried that maybe they're going to launch those things. We don't want them to have better computers to make those, to do better models and to track their missiles better, design new things, new weapons. We don't want that. The argument for not trading with countries like North Korea is pretty straightforward. But so we have other trade restrictions and sanctions against Russia during the Ukraine war now. We've got Iran, Cuba. Of course, we've had a trade restriction with Cuba for decades now. So there are certain examples in time and place where maybe the government steps in and says, I know you'd like to trade with them, but they're our enemies, and we don't want to make them richer and happier, right? Because they're enemies. Remember, trade makes us rich and happy. Maybe we don't want to do that when it comes to North Korea. Okay. So the argument has some merit. The second argument is called dumping. And dumping's a kind of a technical concept. In essence, what it means is selling something below cost. If you sell something below cost, you're said to be dumping. Suppose you sell something for for $8, but it costs you $10 to make it. So it costs $10 to make it, and you sell it for $8. Now, if you're a business school student, that doesn't sound like a good idea. We don't teach business school students at Cox School of Business to go out into the world and make something for $10 and sell it for $8. That's bad business. So why would countries or companies in those countries do such bad business? Why would they intentionally sell products to American consumers below cost and suffer a loss when they do so? Well, the argument is that, what they're going to do is they're going to sell their products below cost. American consumers are going to go buy their products. All the American companies that make those same products will go out of business because they can't compete with those dumped prices. And then after the American companies are all driven out of business, what happens? We raise the prices. So we got them, okay? That's the argument. I've got a couple problems with the argument. First of all, it's never happened. I don't have a single example. Now, it's true that when companies come in with imports, American companies sometimes go out of business. We make no television sets in the United States, none whatsoever. No televisions are made in the United States. When I was a child, we had a dozen television companies. They make televisions all over the country, factories and jobs and everything. None of them are made in the United States today. All the imported televisions have done such a good job, and American consumers have bought those televisions from Korea and China and everywhere else, Japan. They don't buy American televisions. The American television companies are all out of business. When are they going to raise prices? Because last time I went on Amazon looking for a television, those prices aren't going up, they're going down. All right? So it's that last part of the logic that I think is the problem. Yes, it's true that countries and companies can come in and, put it in quotes if you want, but dump their products into the American market. It does sometimes drive American companies out of business, but we never seem to see that last part. We never seem to see the prices go up after the fact. And I think the reason is that maybe they weren't dumping at all. Maybe they were just good at their jobs. Maybe it was that specialization in trade that we've already talked about. Maybe South Korea, maybe China, maybe Japan, maybe they're just really good at making televisions, better than we are. And so it's actually a good thing. It's that specialization thing that we talked about earlier. The other argument you hear with respect to dumping is that sometimes governments in other countries will subsidize companies. So you'll hear that the Chinese government is subsidizing a Chinese company and the American companies can't compete with those subsidies. Now, first of all, the American government subsidizes American companies too. So, you know, all governments all over the world, I'm not in favor of this, but the reality is all governments all over the world subsidize companies. Okay, so the United States is one of them, China is one of them, Mexico is one of them, everybody does it, all right? So it's a little bit rich for American companies to complain about subsidies when they receive them themselves. But the second thing is, I'm not sure it's a bad thing. If the Chinese government wants to tax its citizens to make my televisions cheap, yeah, I'm okay with that. If they want to subsidize my standard of living, I think this is not smart on their part. I think they're dumb to do this. I mean, I think the Chinese government shouldn't subsidize my lifestyle, but if they really want to subsidize and make my products cheaper, I'm kind of willing to let them do that. I'm being a little bit flippant, but not totally. Because seriously, if the governments of China and Mexico, if they want to make things cheap for me, I'm generally in favor of cheap stuff. Like Adam Smith was in favor of cheap wine, I'm in favor of cheap televisions. So the third argument is the infant industry argument. It's the one that's most closely identified with the founding father, Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton recognized that in the colonial and the early part of the American Republic, there wasn't a lot of manufacturing in the United States. There was only like one iron foundry at the time of the Revolution in the entire 13 colonies. And that made it hard for us to build, to make cannons and rifles, but also just everyday things like plows and shovels and stoves. So Alexander Hamilton says, you know, what we need to do is we need to protect these infant industries, these baby new industries that we are just getting started in the United States. We need to protect them from foreign competition because there's just no way that our new American foundries are going to compete with the ones in England that have been around for decades or even more than a century. So the idea was just like human babies, we don't let them just compete freely with adults, we protect babies. Well, we should do the same thing with industries. Now, the problem with this argument, I'm not a fan of it at all, but if the problem with the argument is that it doesn't do a good job at all of explaining what we actually do. If you look at the industries in the United States that get protected from foreign competition, it's things like textiles and agriculture, cars, things like that. Now, none of these are new industries. We've had textile mills in the United States for more than 100 years. Cars go back decades. Agriculture is the first industry that the United States ever had. These are not infant industries. These are mature adult industries. They should be, according to Alexander Hamilton, once you're mature, you should be you should be competing freely with the rest of the world. You don't get any more special protections. Now, the industries in the United States that are infants are things like pharmaceuticals and software. Now, they actually get no protection. So if you were a modern day Alexander Hamilton, what you would do is you should advocate for protecting the pharmaceutical industries and maybe the software coders and things like that. And we should not be protecting corn farmers or textile mills. So the argument for infant industry, if it has any merit at all, and I'm not really sure that it does, if it has merit at all, it doesn't do a good job of explaining what we actually do. So those are the three arguments: national defense, dumping, and infant industry. All three of them have a, let's say, ring of plausibility to them. They're not completely crazy, perhaps. I'm not a big fan of any one of them, but they're not insane. But let's be honest with ourselves. Why do we actually have trade protection? Why can't we freely trade with the rest of the world as much as we might like? Well, the answer is there are special interests in the United States that don't want to let us trade. One example is the sugar industry. In the United States, the sugar industry has lobbied Congress, and they have passed laws called sugar quotas. The sugar quota is a limit on the amount of sugar that can come into the United States. Now, what happens if you reduce the amount of sugar that can be imported? Well, it makes the price of sugar in the United States higher. In a typical year, the price of sugar in the United States is about 2 times what it is in the world. So it's much more expensive in the United States. Now, one of the consequences of that is if you use sugar in your company, if you're a buyer of sugar, that means all of the sugar you buy is going to be twice as expensive as it otherwise would be. So you might look for an alternative. In fact, Coca-Cola found an alternative. In this Coca-Cola bottle, carbonated water, second ingredient, high fructose corn syrup. High fructose corn syrup. Not sugar, regular old cane granulated sugar, that's called sucrose. This is fructose. This comes from corn. Why aren't they using sucrose? Because, you know, if you go to Mexico or Indonesia or Congo or any country in the world, you get a Coca-Cola, looks pretty much the same, tastes very similar, and they use sucrose, regular old-fashioned granulated sugar. So America, they use corn syrup. The rest of the world uses regular sugar. Well, the answer is obvious now, right? Because in America, regular sugar is 2 times more expensive than the rest of the world, so America switched to fructose. The rest of the world sticks with the cheap sucrose. So if you've ever wondered why Mexican Coke tastes different than American Coke, it's not because of the American consumers and the palate or the taste buds of American consumers. It's because we made our sugar so expensive. Now, why did we do that? Why do we make sugar so expensive? Well, the answer is sugar farmers. We've got a small group of people in Louisiana mainly, some in Florida. There used to be some in Hawaii, but I think they're mostly out of business. There's actually a few in Texas. There's about 20,000 sugar farms in America. That's it. Employs maybe a few tens of thousands of people. It's a small industry. It's a tiny industry. Well, if you were running a business and there was a law in Congress that would double your price of the thing you sell, if you're a sugar farmer and there's a law in Congress like the sugar quota that will double the price of sugar, are you going to lobby Congress for that law to be passed? You betcha. I'm going to call my congressman. I'm going to create a lobby. I'm going to show up with candy or whatever sugar, what's the sugar your lobby bring to the congressman and the senator's offices? They're going to show up with big candy baskets. Here's some American sugar. It's good stuff. So Congress passes the law because of the lobbying. Now, who are the big losers? Us. All of us who have to buy sugar in our cookies and our cupcakes and our colas. It's costing us American consumers. I've seen estimates that it costs about $100, maybe $200 per consumer a year. A couple $100. Are you going to call Congress to save $200? I know the answer already because I know none of you have called Congress about this. Nobody even knew about this probably. Right? The fact is, no one who's harmed by this bothers to call Congress to exercise their voice or their vote to oppose the sugar quota because it's only a couple $100. It's not really worth my time and effort to do that. But if you're a sugar farmer, it's worth millions of dollars per sugar farmer. So we have sugar quotas and we have other trade restrictions, not really because of national defense or dumping or infant industries. We really have them because domestic industries in the United States, like sugar, have lobbied for those laws to protect themselves from competition. And what it does, in essence, though, is harm the rest of us. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the most common complaint that you hear about trade. It's about, what about the jobs? Do jobs get eliminated? Does trade with other countries cost jobs? Well, the answer, in a sense, is yes. I grew up in the American Midwest. I watched General Motors and Ford and Chrysler plants close. Friends of mine, family members of mine lost their jobs because of Toyota and Honda, and more recently Hyundai and Kia, BMW and Mercedes. All of these foreign cars that came into the United States in the 70s and the 80s, they did a number on the American car business, and lots of American jobs in the car industry disappeared. Does trade cost jobs, and therefore do trade restrictions save jobs? In a sense, the answer is yes, but really the answer is no. And the reason is you got to think about it. What happens if I give $1? Well, it's going to cost more than $1. But what if I buy a BMW and I have a bunch of dollars and I hand those dollars to BMW in Germany and they send me a car? Okay, I got a car. They now have these dollars. What do these Germans do with American dollars? Do they wallpaper their offices with the dollars? No, they don't do that. Where are American dollars useful? Mostly in America. So what do Germans who get our dollars when we buy BMWs, they get a bunch of dollars, what do? They come back to America and say, hey, what do you guys got for sale here? And they buy exports. They buy stuff in America that they want to buy, like pharmaceuticals, which is one of the things we now have an emerging comparative advantage in. They buy our products. They also invest here. They're now making BMWs in South Carolina. They take some of the dollars that we give them to buy BMWs, they take back and they reinvest those dollars in the United States. And what happens when companies invest in the United States? To jobs. It creates jobs. What happens when companies bring money back to buy exports from American firms? It creates jobs. So yes, imports cost jobs in those industries that compete with those imports, but the money that the foreigners get comes back to us and it creates jobs in other industries. So it's not true that jobs are lost when we trade with the rest of the world. Some jobs are lost, but other jobs are gained. And at the end of the day, we're all going to have jobs somewhere as long as we are free to trade. So let me summarize. So the two reasons we should be happy about trade. First, it makes us happy. The second reason we should be happy about trade is because it makes us rich. Well, at least it makes us have houses, cars, and things like dentists. And for that reason, we should be very happy to have trade in our lives. And I want to thank you all for listening to my lesson about why trade is such a great thing. Thank you.